All right, good evening and welcome to Nikos RPG. I am Jonathan Albin and this is Game Master's Soapbox. Welcome to our episode. Tonight we're going to be talking about session zeros, what they are, how they function, and why you might want to be part of one. Before we do that, make sure you go down below and click the like and subscribe button so that you'll be sure to be updated every time we do a new episode, and so that we let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about session zeros, and session zero has been a topic that's been kind of hot on YouTube for a while, and I'm not sure that it's as clear as it might be. A session zero is the period of time that you and your players get together to talk about the session, about what's going to go on in the adventure, and particular information that the players will need to know once we get started. So we're going to talk today about what you should expect in a session zero, kind of like a checklist, not necessarily in any particular order, but the pieces that will come up during a session zero that will help you get your footing when you're getting ready to start playing a role-play game. So the first thing that will be developed is the concept of the framework of play, and this is a really fancy way of saying what rules, mechanics you'll be using, what particular setting conditions you'll be adding to the adventure, and elements that will capture, elements that will capture what is going on in the game piece by piece. Some game masters use a single role-play mechanism, and therefore it's a relatively simple framework of play. Others will use the combat system from one particular game element, or perhaps a hybrid or a homebrew of their own in determining how things play out. But having a good understanding of what the framework is really helps to make it easier to play, because you'll know which section or which type of rules mechanisms that you're using. Now, not all session zeros will have to have a distinct description of framework of play. As a matter of fact, most will be within a singular game system. So this is not particularly significant unless you have a game master who has a broadly developed world and perhaps has unique elements that he wishes to focus on during play. Now, this does mean that you'll have a longer or perhaps broader discussion of the overview of the rules. And the rules are not necessarily just what you're playing at the table, but it's also the rules of etiquette that you may be required by your game master to play. For example, one of the greatest resources that I found recently is a methodology for knowing whose turn it is to speak. And there are a bunch of nonverbal cues that can be used, but the overview of rules will go over what those would be. So, for example, raise your hand to speak. Certain groups use that. Still others are more improvisational and allow for more direct conversation interaction. But the idea is that the rules of engagement, however they're going to be used, will be outlined in the game session zero, specifically so that those problems will be avoided in later sessions. Now, occasionally you'll have to have a group get together, perhaps like episode 2.5 or something, where you actually re-break down the clarifications and redefine what those rules are if there's been some kind of a challenge. But generally this will happen right at the beginning of your gameplay experience. When you're doing a session zero, you'll also want to have some sort of prologue of events. Talk about what's been going on in the world at the beginning of the story. The story doesn't start with the birth of a character. Generally, the story begins somewhere considerably after the character's creation. And so by building out the characteristics of the world at the instant that the game is going to begin is helpful. And having a prologue of perhaps foreshadowing, perhaps elements of the story that have older roots will help to anchor the story in framework and let the players make a solid position from that. It's elementally obvious that you can't know everything about the background of a story, but by having a little bit of an understanding, it does give you a fair grounding for what decisions you might make in the story. I mentioned before, but this is also particularly the point where in a session 0 where there's a discussion of the house rules. This might be how your dice are rolled, whether they can roll out of the box, whether you let them fall on the ground and read them as they lay, or whether you pick up the dice, or whether you have to have 1 or 2 eyewitnesses to your die rolls. All of these little nuances help to make it so that the play will become fluid and not have to be so overwatched, so to speak. And when you have a rather extensive house rules, you may have an entire document that the players and the game master will go over to improve the play experience going forward. Obviously, there's going to be a considerable amount of feedback going back and forth between the game master and the players, and so having a very clear understanding that your questions are encouraged and are going to be openly answered really helps to anchor the player into the story and make sure any glitches or any hitches in the system are already sort of hammered out in advance of the game session. It's important when you're doing a session 0, of course, that the game master and player are in a give and take relationship, because first time playing, you're not sure how your players are going to hope to interact. You're not going to know whether they are particularly intent on finding out what the world is like by their own actions. So do they have a you only live once attitude, or perhaps they are more fluid than that? And by having the questions and answers going back and forth, the players can become familiar with the game master, and the game master can become familiar with the way the players play. Now, when you're doing this also, there's a matter of style. And by style here, I'm not necessarily talking about, the narrative, but instead I'm speaking of the way in which they express things. If they have a structure to the way they interact, then having an understanding of that style will make it easier for your character's interaction in the story to fit in with what is going on within the world. And this understanding of style also will help you to get a handle on whether an action is overt and against cultural norms, or if this is a one-off because the game master is desiring it to be so. An understanding of an overview really helps also for you to make your comments fit into the framework of the storyteller, so that the game will feel more like a connected communication rather than a two-dimensional flat piece of paper where the game master says thus and the players say thus. Now, this also ties into the very concepts of protocol. If, for example, in the case of a Nikos RPG game, it's usually protocol for the player to fundamentally request permission to use a skill, or to ask whether a certain skill might be appropriate, and if warranted, then the game master will allow a dice roll against it, which means therefore all of the triggers, the concept of advancing your skills and such, automate, and therefore having an idea of how the game is played and which dice rolls are appropriate when really does help to make the game feel more natural and fluid. When you're also talking about protocol, you're referring to whether or not there should be an opportunity, perhaps an ample opportunity for conversation to occur rather than simply switching the gun, so to speak, and turning just to the dice rolls. So a matter of give and take is understood, and the discussion of how protocol will play out is really useful in that session 0. Now, in this conversation, as you're hearing from the game master what he's trying to present in the story, this is also opportunity for you as a player to give pre-game feedback, things that you are hoping to look for within the game, conditions you'd like to meet within the setting, perhaps find out more information about a particular nuance that you find interesting. And this pre-game feedback helps the game master to make the story fit with all of the players in particular, and being able to weave the story between what the characters are expecting and the game master is providing. Of course, there are always going to be those unasked questions, and this is actually the place where they can be asked. And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but there are conditions of safety concerns and dialogue levels. For example, if you have younger players, perhaps you're going to need to state outwardly that the fundamental reading level will be a certain such, so that the players can be prepared for the interactions that will come within that game. There will be perhaps discussions over what is the level of intensity of your dialogue. Are you going for body horror, or if this is just a hand wavium of all of the strange or odd to make it easier for players to assimilate. Having a time period where you can have these questions that normally would not be asked covered really is important to make sure your game feels safe for all players involved. And then, of course, in the session 0, you should be preloading the session specifics for that very first session so the players can hit the ground running and know that the story is literally launching with the first thing that is said at the game session. If you're able to, therefore, get past all of the challenges of the game that you have intended, you'll make for a much more fun, more enjoyable play session overall. So finally, what it comes down to is that your players are going to be preparing themselves for the engagement and wanting to be a part of the story. So if you have any questions about what you could do or what's proper to include in a parting shot, feel free to leave that in the comments below. I'll be glad to help you out with that and provide any information that I can. If you would like to have an episode that would be functionally an acting session 0, put a comment down below and I'll see what we can do about developing that. It's something I've been considering for a while, the idea of actually playing through a session 0 for one of my settings so that you have a clearer understanding of how that works. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you in the next episode. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and go play.